Muted.
So as we move on about what causes us stress, the purpose of this conversation is related specifically to critical incident stress management, but how it applies in our work environment or what sort of experiences we have in our work environment. So Mike, if we could go forward, there's going to be two more. Okay. We talked about the factors that contribute to our stress. We talked about the internal factors that we can control, things within our lives that we can control, and the external factors that we cannot control. Now I want to get down into the nuts and bolts of this, which is our coworkers and our supervisors, because the biggest form of stress seems to be coworkers and supervisors. So my first question is, how do our coworkers cause us stress? I threw out a couple of key examples here, and I want you guys to be thinking about a couple of examples of your own. But how about when they don't do their job? Does that cause us stress when our coworkers do not do our job? Okay. The opposite extreme also causes us stress. How many of you have got a coworker that does their job, but then comes over and helps you do your job as well? That's a source of stress in my office from time to time. And then the third one is simply not knowing their boundaries, whether those boundaries are verbal, somebody plays loud music in their cubicle, or somebody gets on telephone calls that are private but very loud. It could be physical. Somebody standing over your shoulder, and I mean literally standing over your shoulder while you're attempting to get some work done. It could also be olfactory. Every once in a while, there's a coworker of mine that likes to bring in a tuna sandwich and eat it at their cubicle. And so the whole office smells like tuna. That is a stressful day for me. That increases my stress. So there's lots of ways our coworkers cause us stress. And I don't want to call anybody out, but just privately start thinking about that. What ways do your coworkers cause you stress in your office? Now that's dealing with coworkers. There's another person in our office that causes us stress. I'm a supervisor, but every supervisor has a supervisor. And if my supervisor is not engaged, isn't aware of what's going on, isn't aware of the alerts that we're putting out or the situations that we're dealing with, that can be a cause of stress. If I turn around to ask a question, policy, and my supervisor is nowhere to be found, I have to spend several minutes rounding them up to ask them a policy question, that increases my stress. So supervisors who are not engaged enough. As a supervisor, I've been accused of the second one, which is the reverse of that. I can be too engaged as a supervisor from time to time. On more than one occasion, I have been instructed to leave my office because I was a distraction to my employees while they were trying to get the real work done. So sometimes I do not give a clear leader's intent or vision. My priorities change at the management level, and I forget to communicate that to my people. That can cause stress. And occasionally we run across a supervisor that will say one thing but does something else. It only takes one time for that to happen when they've lost my credibility, lost my respect, and I can't trust or rely upon them. Is that a form of stress? Absolutely. So those are all ways as a supervisor that we can cause stress to our employees, or as employees, our supervisors can make our jobs even more difficult. Finally, in every line of work, there's that one activity or that one situation that causes us stress. So what activities are the most stressful for you in your line of work, in your job? As meteorologists or fire meteorologists, what is that one situation that really causes you the most stress? I want you to think on that one because we're going to come back to that one in just a second. But the reason I bring up the coworkers and supervisors and stress is bottom line is we do not work in a vacuum. We work with coworkers. Our job is a team environment situation where we need to rely upon each other. And stress and teamwork go hand in hand. If you want to decrease stress in an office, you increase the teamwork. If you want to increase stress in an office, and I don't know why you would want to, but bad teamwork will certainly increase the stress of your working environment. So this is the part where we come to the exercise. This is the part where I asked y'all to have a separate piece of paper and a writing instrument. So if you could get those out quickly, we'll go ahead and start our exercise as it relates to coworkers in stress. So if we'll move to the next slide. Number one, we want you to write your name on the top of a blank piece of paper. Number two, write 3 things that you think you do when you are stressed on the job. When the job is stressing you out, identify 3 things that you personally think that you do. These are known as signs. Could be things like talking fast, using my hands, raising my voice, running around and talking to everybody, or locking myself down into a specific job and not talking to anybody. Identify 3 things that you do when you are very stressed on the job. Now, hopefully you can come up with 3 things that you do when you're stressed on the job. If not, that should give you an indication that perhaps you're not as tuned to your own stress as perhaps you should be. There's one more thing I want you to do with that piece of paper, and that's the next step, which is at the very bottom of the page, regardless of how big your page is. Write the one activity or situation that causes you the most stress in your work environment. What is the one thing that stresses you out the most? When this happens, this is when you become most stressed. All right, this is where the exercise gets really fun. I'm going to assume that nobody is sitting in an office all by themselves here, that you have got a coworker, somebody else sitting in this office with you. So the next thing that you're going to do, turn that page over and write your name on the back of it. And the next step is, without turning it back over, hand that page to somebody else. Go ahead and hit the next one. Exchange that paper with a coworker.
Yeah, touch base with you since I'm their supervisor.
Yeah. Okay. We'll do our best here. I'm going to have a hard time. We'll do what we can.
Oh, yeah, because you don't know me.
I don't
wish
know.
Frank was in here, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've exchanged the page with our coworker, what I want you to do is I want you to look at that piece of paper you just received. Now, whoever's name is on that piece of paper, I want you to write down the 3 things that that person does when they're extremely stressed.
It's not fair for them to do it to me since I'm supervising.
Yeah.
Gee whiz, I don't know, I've never really seen you stressed. So, let's see, so 3 things or one?
If you can come up with 3 things, come up with 3 things. So this is an opportunity for you to discover, number 1, do you know yourself well enough to know what things you do when you're stressed? Number 2, do you know what you really do when you're stressed? Because my coworkers have pointed out to me that I do something entirely different when I'm extremely stressed than what I think I do. And again, the next thing we want you to do is whatever you wrote down on the bottom of your page is that one situation that causes you the most stress. Go ahead and write that on the bottom of this page as well. So whatever it was that came up as your thing that causes you the most stress, go ahead and put that on the back of the page.
Oh, what causes?
Yeah, what causes you the most stress? And finally, we're just going to take that piece of paper and we're going to hand it back to our original author. The next step is simply compare notes.
Yeah, you got pretty good, Mike.
So what are your stress reactions? Do you do what your coworkers think you do when you're stressed?
Not entirely. So.
Okay. Do your coworkers agree that when you're stressed, you do these things? So the question is, how well do your reactions match up with what other people are seeing of you? And then finally, compare notes on what you consider to be the most stressful activity or situation, and do these match? Now, one of two things will happen on this last one. Either you do agree on what is the most stressful situation, in which case maybe you need to consider ways of mitigating that stress. If it is the same situation that bothers everybody, then perhaps you need to be thinking about something you're going to do to help manage that stress when that situation comes up. Or on the other hand, maybe you have different things that cause you stress. In which case that's important to know, because if looking at the radar is what causes me the most stress when a tornado is coming through, but talking to the media causes my coworker the most stress, then maybe when it's time to talk to the media, I should be the person who does that, and maybe when it's time to be looking at the radar, my coworker should be doing that. Know each other's stressors, what causes you the most stress, and work together as a team to identify those stressors and to mitigate those stressors. This is strictly a stress awareness exercise. You do it with a group of coworkers to find out, number one, do I really know what I do when I'm stressed? Number two, how well do my coworkers understand when I'm really stressed? And number three, are we having the same or different stressful situations that we have to manage? What stresses me out, is it the same thing that stresses my coworkers out? If so, how are we going to work through this as a team? If not, how can we help each other out with those situations that individually stress each other? So let's talk about what this looks like in a normative or a normal situation. All right, if you got 0 of 3 correct with your coworker, that's a below average level of stress awareness. Only getting 1 of 3 is typical. Only being able to match up 1 of 3 is typical. 2 out of 3, you have an above average level of awareness. And of course, if you have 3 out of 3, you have a very strong awareness of coworker stress. Now, the good news is, having completed this exercise, I would hope that you would take this information, and if you were asked those same questions tomorrow, you would be able to identify 3 out of 3 when it comes to working with your coworker on what causes them stress. So that was the purpose of that exercise. That was the purpose of that piece of paper. I hope you guys find it beneficial. And after this presentation later on, maybe you could do a follow-up discussion with each other. Why do you think I do that? Or, hey, yeah, maybe I do really do that when I'm stressed out. Again, when it comes to the stressful situation that we're talking about, the stressful activity, knowing whether it helps or hurts, whether it's similar or different. So, all right, we've acknowledged that we're stressed. So what? Who cares? Everybody has stress in their lives. It happens to everybody all the time. So what does this mean? Number one, excessive stress causes physical, emotional, spiritual, and interpersonal problems. We mentioned that before. Number two, teamwork and communication are negatively affected. Times of most stress are the times when we need the greatest level of teamwork and communication, and yet then the stress will clearly affect teamwork and communication. Number three, it can lead to serious, if not managed, our reactions can become a potential crisis. Number four, this could lead to serious health issues. Now, I am not a medical doctor, but it doesn't take much research to tie in the relationship between stress and health issues. And then finally, stress, in fact, can lead to suicide. And we're going to discuss suicide briefly here in a few minutes, but I do want to emphasize that suicide is a response to severe stress as one of the potential conditions that causes somebody to complete suicide. And ultimately, death is the worst case health scenario. So how do we manage stress? First thing we need to manage stress is simply to acknowledge it. If you can flip those up. It's inherent in life. Each of us has our own tools for managing stress. These tools will include attitudes and behaviors. These attitudes and behaviors may be conscious or subconscious. Back to that exercise we just did. If you struggle to identify 3 things that you do when you're very stressed, chances are you're unconsciously doing stress relievers. And finally, they can be categorized as either healthy or unhealthy ways of managing stress. I'm going to take a minute to talk about the unhealthy ways of managing stress. When we think about unhealthy ways of managing stress, internalization and denial is one. When I ask somebody, so how are you? And their response is, I'm fine. And they're saying it through gritted teeth with their jaw locked. They're just denying their level of stress at the moment. Excessive self-medication. If you choose to go outside of the prescripted amount of medication, whether it's a legal or illegal form of medication, if you go atypical of beyond what you normally do, that's excessive self-medication. Non-productive conversations. You know, there's a time for what they call cathartic ventilation where you just blow off steam. But non-productive conversations such as complaining, whining, etc., bad-mouthing a coworker, bad-mouthing a situation that really don't do anything except for increase the level of stress, not helpful in a work environment. Hostility. We have both verbal and physical. I want to emphasize that hostility can be verbal. You can be extremely verbally hostile to a coworker or someone else. Physical hostility doesn't mean having to physically strike somebody else. It could simply be slamming your fist on the desk. So hostility, not helpful forms of stress management. This can lead into depression. Now, depression is a clinical diagnosis. I'm not in a position to speak to that issue other than to say that depression is an unhealthy way of handling stress. Insomnia, not simply one night, but multiple nights. Again, not healthy for you overall, not a good way of managing stress. Finally, we talk about other ways of handling stress in unhealthy ways, one of which would be aggressive or even reckless driving. There are several others. I encourage you guys to stop and take a minute. Think about the unhealthy ways that you manage stress. What are some of the unhealthy ways you manage stress? Give me just a minute because I don't want to run out of time today, but take a good minute and talk about it amongst yourselves. Okay, hopefully you guys have identified at least one or two ways in which you may engage in an unhealthy method of managing your stress. I do want to point out that while there are clearly several unhealthy methods of managing stress, there are lots of positive ways to manage stress. For example, exercise, laughter, prayer and meditation, constructive conversations, as opposed to negative or destructive conversations. Hugging, human contact, or intimacy, make sure you're doing that in the right context to ensure we are decreasing stress, not increasing it. Music, hobbies. I have another slide that covers additional ways. Taking a little time off. Television, movies, video games, other forms of escapism to include reading. Comfort foods. There you go. Somebody brought up fried chicken here in the South. That's a way of handling your comfort food. Socialization, sometimes just getting out with your peers and chatting, talking about your day is positive. And then, of course, there's such things as critical incident stress management tools, a pre-incident education, presentations like this, learning how to manage stress, and after-action reviews are both positive ways of managing stress. So, I want to move on to the critical incident stress management itself, however. We discussed briefly what a critical incident is, a atypical, awful, or powerful event that has the potential to overwhelm an individual's coping tools, resulting in a crisis. And again, the definition of crisis is up there: acute cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, behavioral reaction to an incident. Again, I want to emphasize it is the reaction to the incident, not the incident itself. In critical incident stress management, this is the textbook definition here for you, is a comprehensive, integrated, systematic, multi-component crisis intervention program. And I'm going to show you what that looks like, and you'll see how these things are integrated, systemic, multi-component, and comprehensive. So there are three methodologies when it comes to critical incident stress management. These are the three ways that we engage in critical incident stress management. The first one is the clinician. These are mental health professionals. They are specifically trained to treat trauma. These are not necessarily your family, marriage, or substance abuse counselors. These are clinicians who are trained in treating trauma. Not every clinician is trained in treating trauma. We use clinicians with the Forest Service and the Department of Interior. The next one is the peer. The peer that we use in the Forest Service and Department of Interior are people who have standard day jobs in whatever field, but they've also received additional training in providing peer support to each other. Peers can go places and understand each other more so than a clinician can. And the third one that we actually do not use with the Department of Interior Forest Service is the chaplain, but I do want to emphasize they are used in other federal, state, and local agencies. Most fire departments have got trauma-trained chaplains. When I was with the Disaster Medical Assistance Team, I was a chaplain for those folks. So they do serve a very specific purpose as well. I want to emphasize that a typical CISM response uses at least 2 out of the 3 methodologies. In the Forest Service, when we do a CISM response, we are certainly bringing peers. We are certainly bringing a mental health professional. Other venues and other organizations, they may take a chaplain and a peer, or they may take a chaplain and a clinician, but at least 2 of those methodologies or those disciplines are presented in any CISM response that is done. So that's how you get this interdisciplinary CISM approach. So next one is that there's 6 core elements to a CISM response. There's the assessment and triage, identifying is a CISM response necessary. Again, it's based upon how people are responding to an incident, not necessarily the incident itself. And then trying to identify who's most affected. Then there is the listening skills that all 3 methodologies come. with. I identify the SAFER model. That is the standard model of communication we use in CISM intervention, where we stabilize the situation. We acknowledge what happened and we ask people to tell their story. We facilitate an understanding of their reactions, what they're going through. We encourage constructive coping mechanisms. We help them with recovery or how to move forward from the trauma, and if necessary, we refer them to additional support or additional care. There's the strategic planning section. Those are handled by the CISM team as we try and identify who was affected by the incident, what type of incident, or what type of intervention we're going to use, as well as what sort of common themes we can expect from a particular type of situation. Some of what we include on top of that is informational group crisis intervention. This is where we simply provide information to people. This presentation is an example of a intervention, if you will, a standard crisis management briefing where we provide information to folks. Then we do interactive groups. Interactive groups, we use small, homogeneous groups, small groups that were specifically related to a specific incident, and we interact with them. We have them tell their stories, talk about their experiences and how it's affecting them. We also do debriefings and diffusings. And then finally, we try and foster personal and community resilience through pre-incident education, through resistance training, providing people the information to help them be resistant to traumatic experiences, their resilience, and their recovery. These are all components of crisis intervention. So as we talk about this, we talk about pre-incident education, one-on-one peer support, crisis management briefings where we just provide information to folks, and there's an additional list of additional things that we use. Now, I do emphasize at the bottom there that when we use mental health professionals or chaplains, we use people that are specifically trained in trauma. Not every mental health professional nor every clergy is trained in trauma. So it's important that if you're using a mental health professional or a chaplain, that they be specifically trained in trauma. CISM is designed to be temporary, active, and supportive. It is not long-term care. It is not therapy. So let's talk a little bit about what a CISM response would look like in the wildland fire community, which is my background, and a lot of the incident meteorologists also engage in the wildland fire arena or possibly even a prescribed fire arena. A serious incident or event occurs on an incident. So after that, the next step is there's a request for critical incident stress management. It's sent to the regional or the national CISM coordinator. That national coordinator or that coordinator starts the assessment and the strategic plan. Based upon the assessment and the strategic plan, a team leader is selected. Might be multiple team leaders if it's a big event. Then depending upon the nature of the incident, the peers and the mental health professional are selected. We mobilize within 48 hours to 72 hours post-incident. There is a window for providing CISM support. Typically is 48 to 72 hours. We have found because of a national program that we've got in wildland fire, a lot of our serious incidents may happen remotely. It may take us up to 5 days to get my team on the ground. That said, that's still considered an acceptable window. The point is it must be post-incident. You do not provide critical incident stress management support while the incident is going on, while the trauma is still occurring. And then we provide our crisis intervention. Now, our crisis intervention can look like a couple of different ways. Informational briefings are almost always done where we provide information. Small group dialogues, debriefings, and diffusions are fairly common, but they're done with very small, very select groups of people affected by the incident. We make ourselves available for one-on-one conversations, and we provide informational handouts. Once we've done that, we refer folks as necessary to continuing support. It could be the employee assistance program. It could be long-term care with mental health professionals. It could be referring them to their local clergy or maybe the Red Cross, United Way, or other agencies. So we don't just leave people, we don't just show up, do our thing, and leave. We always leave them an opportunity to pursue additional information or additional support. That's one of the critical components of a CISM response. Next step is we demobilize the team. The team gets pulled together from all over the country depending upon their specialty or if their peers, their specific jobs and skills. At the end of the event, we demobilize. After we demobilize, the team leader will do a follow-up with the agency administrator. In addition to that, we do a follow-up with the team members to make sure that we're taking care of our own. The team members as well receive support. One of the critical components of a CISM response is making sure that those people that provided the critical incident stress management support themselves receive support post-incident. So we talked a little bit about the signs and symptoms, and we mentioned some of the handouts, and I just want to briefly go to the first handout that we give out, which is called the Reactions to Crisis and Trauma. This handout identifies what are fairly typical crisis reactions. They can be physical, cognitive, emotional, relational, behavioral, or spiritual. This handout comes directly from the BLM's Critical Incident Stress Management team, and it identifies common reactions to crisis. One of the things we want folks to know is, yeah, there are fairly common reactions to incidents. That most of the time you are a normal person who's having a normal reaction to what was a atypical, atrocious, non-normal incident. So this lists several of the different reactions that you're going to have potentially. On the back of that sheet, it talks about what you can do within the first 24 to 48 hours. I mentioned earlier, CISM teams don't typically show up until at least 24, sometimes even 3 to 5 days out. So what can you do in the meantime? And it lists things like structure your time, stay busy, reach out to people, maintain your normal work schedule if possible. However, you may need to disengage. You may not want to continue your normal work schedule if this was a on-the-job related incident. There's a section for family members and friends. It's a fairly small section, but I want to emphasize this to you guys. When you look at the front page and it talks about all these typical stress reactions that are common to have, if you yourself are going through a crisis, you will not recognize these within you. This sheet itself is on my refrigerator at my home. For 30 years of doing this, I never know when I'm having a crisis. I don't see it. Fortunately, I have supported family members, and they have this sheet on the refrigerator at my house. And so when I am going through a crisis, it usually takes a family member to walk up to the refrigerator and say, hey, Scott, take a look at this list. Take a look at what's happening with you. Isn't it time for you to get a little further support? So this list is a crucial tool to help you, but more specifically, this is something to take to your family or your coworkers so that they can assist you. So that's one of the handouts that you should have gotten. We've got about 5 minutes left here, and I'm going to ask you guys to bear with me through it because I'm going to kind of switch the situation to what we consider worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario of failed crisis intervention? Suicide. So when we talk about suicide, what we're talking about is a multidimensional malaise in a needful individual who defines an issue for which suicide is perceived as the best solution. Again, textbook explanation to it. I don't want to get caught up in it. I think most of us fully understand what a suicide is. However, I want to talk a little bit about suicide awareness. because when I started looking at the numbers of completed suicides, and I'm using the 2015 numbers, 2016 are still not out by CDC, I was staggered by the number of suicides. In 2015, 44,193. It's the 10th leading cause of death. However, according to the PhDs, that's underrepresented by about 10%. They estimate there's 10% more completed suicides that aren't reported specifically as suicides. Let's put that in context to the National Weather Service. There were 552 weather-related fatalities in the same year. 552 weather-related fatalities, 44,193 completed suicides. Puts it in context for you. But suicide not only affects the individual who completes the suicide, it's estimated that 18 people are affected deeply and personally by every completed suicide. So that takes up to 250,000. On top of that, they estimate that for every completed suicide, 25 people will attempt a suicide. We're over 1.25 million now. These statistics are from 2015. I want to share with you that suicides do have a season, however. They even have a specific month. And I was shocked as I started studying and learning on this, that the month where more suicides are completed than any other month in the year is the month of April. April has more suicides than any other month in the year. So there's a lot of anecdotal discussion on that. Nobody has been able to say specifically why that is. Next page talks a little bit about suicide myths. I want to briefly just acknowledge some of these myths. These are people who are suicidal don't show signs. That's not true. Mentioning suicide will give people the idea to complete it. Again, not accurate. No suicide. Once suicidal, always suicidal. That's not accurate. They say that people who are fully committed to the suicidal act, that focus or that commitment to complete that act lasts less than 72 hours. So if we can get them through the next 72 hours, chances are we've gotten them over the hump. Only depressed people complete suicide. Not accurate. Suicidal people are people who really want to die. Again, they're having a struggle. They're having an issue. They don't see another alternative out. But if we can work with them, get them past those 72 hours, we can potentially help them. People who are suicidal need hospitalization or medication. Very seldom do they need medication or hospitalization. And I cannot stop a suicide from happening. Again, if we intervene, we get this person assistance, there's a 72-hour window. After that, most of them are over the hump. So we talk a little bit about the factors or the main risk factors of suicide, depression, of course, being one, substance abuse, prior attempts, history of suicide, access to firearms, and exposure to other suicides. The next page we're going to talk about is just the warning signs of suicide. I am going through this a little fast. I do want to emphasize that the handouts you have also cover this information, so I don't want to belabor the point. I want to get to a question and answer session with you guys. But when we look at warning signs, behavioral, an increase or dramatic change in behavior, specifically related to drug or alcohol use, researching ways to complete suicide, overly reckless, withdrawing from activities, isolation, substantial changes to sleep, sudden rush to complete wills or final testaments. In and of themselves, no one of them is a sign, but you start looking for red flags here. And then people's talk or their moods. And again, fatalistic statements, talking of feeling trapped, or suddenly coming at peace with yourself over everything that's happening. That could be another red flag. And the moods, depression, apathy, feeling of hopelessness is a huge one, irritability, humiliation, or anxiety. Again, all these come from the National Institute of Mental Health. There is a handout that covers these. What to do. Don't assume about a suicide, ask the question. Most people are afraid to ask the question, are you feeling suicidal? There's two reasons for this. The first one is the myth. I don't want to put the idea in somebody's head. More prevalent is I don't want the answer, because if that person says yes, I'm suddenly on the hook for their safety and well-being. So what do? Somebody says yes. First thing, don't overreact. They've trusted you enough to give you some information, some critical information. What do you do with that? There is a specific concept called CCDR, clarify, contradict, delay, and refer. This is not a course on suicide intervention. I'm not going to go into that. I wanted to briefly mention this because if you're interested, there is very formal training on how to deal with this. And then finally, know your resources. The two handouts I give talk about 1-800-273-TALK is a national suicide hotline number. If you call that number, you're not going to get somebody out of Boise, Idaho, unless you're in Boise, Idaho. It's a 1-800 national number, but it will take you to the local suicide prevention line. So I want to emphasize that. Maybe your EAP is a good choice, chaplains, peer support, and worst case scenario, 911. So what do? Somebody has told us. We talk about not overreacting. You must always refer to a higher level of care. You must never lead a suicidal person alone. Finally, what I want to emphasize on suicide, compassion takes no special training, but training is certainly available. So let's talk a little bit about the training that is available. The International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, ICISF.org. They are the international trainers that provide multiple courses, everything from trauma intervention, group crisis intervention, pastoral crisis intervention for clergy that want to be trauma trained, all the way down to the suicide prevention, intervention, postvention. They are a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information. So ICISF.org. The next one is the Wildland Fire Critical Incident Stress Management Program. For those who work in the wildland fire community, that first sheet where I talked about the different signs and symptoms, that is available directly off that website. If you're interested in training specifically with the wildland firefighters who are doing this type of CISM training, all the classes and availability are listed there. There's a couple of national CISM coordinators. You can contact them as well. So these are some excellent training specifically related with the wildland fire community. That's both Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture. Okay, there's the additional handouts. I have one, says 1-800-273-TALK right across top. Goes into suicide facts, main risk factors, behavior, those things that we briefly talked about as well. Then there is the CISM reactions, which was the first handout I gave you. And finally, I being a numbers guy, I'm really into the statistics of this. I share with you the 2015 statistics of suicide. If you want to look at how many suicides happened in your state, 2015, what's the national average, broken down by demographics, regions of the country, etc. That page there, full of statistics, very impressive information in my opinion. The more you know, the better you're able to deal with this. Okay. Additionally, there are the websites. I've already mentioned these two. The top one is the Wildland Fire Critical Incident Stress Management website. The other one is for the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. You can check out those websites. Finally, and I'm going to ask that we leave this slide up while we move into the question and answer portion of this. My name is Scott Russell. This is how you can contact me. That is my government email. That is my work telephone number. That work telephone number does ring 24 hours a day. We are an all-risk fire dispatch center. You will talk to a living person 24 hours a day if you call that number, and they can get you in touch with me if you'd like to talk to me. I realize we have folks from all over the country, and I'm just a guy out of Columbia, South Carolina. When it comes to critical incident stress management, the U.S. Forest Service National Coordinator, my boss at the national level of this, is a gentleman by the name of Eric Martinez. He's out of Southern California, so he's on the West Coast time. He is the National CISM Coordinator. That is his email address and his telephone number to reach him. If at any point in time, either Eric or myself, the U.S. Forest Service, can be of any assistance to you, do not hesitate to contact either one of us by phone or by mail. That concludes my presentation. I went a little longer than I thought I was going to, but I appreciate y'all hanging in there with me. I really want to open up the floor for questions at this point in time, provide you any additional information I can.
Larry, this is Mike. If we want to go ahead and cut the recording off.
Yeah, I can stop the recording. Just heads up to all attendees is that you are unmuted in terms of the conference line. So if you want to ask questions, you can unmute your phone and go ahead and